So what happens typically in a ocean carbon dioxide removal is we find various ways to actually extract carbon dioxide from the surface ocean. Think about whether or not we're talking about direct ocean removal, or whether we're talking about macroalgae or ocean iron fertilization or oceanography enhancement. You may have heard some of these different terms. And these are all just terms to describe different ways in which we can actually leverage the ocean's natural ability to take up carbon. That extraction of carbon dioxide allows even more to come in from the atmosphere and then be stored within the ocean. You can think of the ocean as sort of a giant carbon sponge. So it's naturally holding a huge amount of carbon dioxide. Storage capacity is like the size of that sponge. And then its ability to kind of move in and out is that natural process that the ocean has.
Yes. You're listening to Bite Size Climate Tech, Season 3. Hi, Dr. Alicia.
Hi, Lydia. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you again. Super excited I actually got you on this show to open this season for us. Dr. Alicia Karspeck is the co-founder and chief technology officer at Seaworthy, a nonprofit research organization focused on developing open source software for quantifying ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. With a Ph.D. in climate science and oceanography from Columbia University, having led key projects at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, Alicia's work spans across the public and private sectors. I'm super honored to invite you to our show. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
If you want to add a little bit of who you are.
That was a great introduction. Yeah, so I've spent my career as a climate scientist working in the research space. And over the last about half decade, I have also explored more in the private sector and then also a bit in the nonprofit space. And so this is my first foray into founding my own nonprofit with two other great partners. And so it's a really exciting place to be right now in terms of working on climate solutions.
Yeah, exactly. What an exciting time to be alive and make things happen. I'm super excited for our conversation because ocean is a fascinating topic. You're just going to explain it to us, this concept of how actually ocean removes CO2.
Yeah, so let me just go for it. It can seem very complicated to think about the way that ocean-based carbon dioxide removals methods work. And so I want to just kind of break it down into some of the big pieces of that to help people understand. There's a whole lot of different pathways. Pathways is the term that we use to think about whether or not we're talking about direct ocean removal, or whether we're talking about macroalgae or ocean iron fertilization or oceanography enhancement. You may have heard some of these different terms. And these are all just terms to describe different ways in which we can actually leverage the ocean's natural ability to take up carbon to have it take up more. Back up a bit. Let me just say something about the way that the ocean naturally works with carbon. You can think of the ocean really, and this is just an analogy, as sort of a giant carbon sponge. So it's naturally holding a huge amount of carbon dioxide, also holding just carbon in the form of what's called bicarbonate. So we've got a lot of carbon in the ocean naturally. Every single year, it's breathing in and out carbon dioxide. About 300 gigatons is moving in and out naturally all the time out of the ocean. So it's a very natural process to have carbon dioxide moving in and out of the ocean. When we think about doing carbon dioxide removal interventions like we're talking about, what we're trying to do is to create situations where the ocean will take up and store even more carbon than it would do naturally. So what happens typically in a ocean carbon dioxide removal is we find various ways to actually extract carbon dioxide from the surface ocean. That extraction of carbon dioxide allows even more to come in from the atmosphere and then be stored within the ocean. So that's how all of the methods work. Now, let me just walk through like 3 of the different pathways so you can see that they all work slightly differently, but they all use the same method of thinking about removing CO2 in some way from the ocean, and then that actually draws in from the atmosphere. So you may have heard of something called direct ocean removal. Direct ocean removal is sometimes considered to be analogous to direct air capture. In direct ocean removal, we actually just through industrial processes, actually just strip CO2 directly out of the ocean. And then we store that in permanent storage somewhere else. Usually it's some kind of form of geological storage. And then it actually just re-equilibrates with the atmosphere. So the CO2 comes in from the atmosphere and just fills that right up. So that's direct ocean removal. There's a number of companies who work in that space. Another one you may have heard of is called ocean alkalinity enhancement. In ocean alkalinity enhancement, what we do is we add alkaline materials. Alkaline materials are ones that you're probably familiar with in regular life, things like sodium hydroxide, olivine. These are naturally occurring minerals. We add additional amounts to those, and what those do is they help the ocean actually shift some of the natural CO2 that's in there into stable forms of carbon that's called bicarbonate. That shifting allows then, again, more CO2 to come in from the atmosphere into the ocean. So that's how that one works. And the other one you probably heard of is things like an iron fertilization or macroalgae cultivation. So these are ideas of actually leveraging some of the natural biological processes, allow us to sort of take in the biological.
It's like trees in the ocean.
There's
It's like
trees in
trees.
the ocean, right? And they're
Yes.
actually taking CO2 up within the ocean and transferring it into organic carbon. But that
Okay.
taking of the CO2 in the ocean then allows more to come on in. So all of them really work in this method of extracting in some way CO2 from the ocean and then letting it re-equilibrate with the atmosphere. And then, of course, there's the different storages that happen. So in the first one I talked about, we're actually stripping it out and storing it elsewhere. In the case of ocean alkalinity enhancement, we're storing it in a stable form called bicarbonate in the ocean itself. And in the case of things like macroalgae cultivation or growing trees, like you point out, growing trees in the ocean, in that case, you're storing it as organic carbon. Kind of an overview, basic level of how ocean carbon dioxide removal works. And of course, there's a lot more details, a lot of technical details inside of there.
Such a clear overview, such a clear and short explanation in terms of how ocean works and how you actually put them all in parallel in terms of they're all just trying to extract CO2 in some way, shape, or form. So then ocean can work its own function as what you just described, the breathing in and out. It's like a lung of the earth.
That's right.
That's fascinating. I have a question. The 300 gigaton, is it the maximum that ocean can process?
So it's kind of just the natural, I would say typical right now at this point in time. That amount can actually change year to year. So that's more of an average. And remember, this is just CO2 kind of breathing in and out. What that means is like in some seasons and in some locations, maybe it's outgassing CO2. And in other seasons, other locations of the ocean, it's actually taking up CO2. Again, totally natural process there. The ocean actually, in terms of its storage capacity for carbon, it's storing about 40,000 gigatons of carbon naturally. So it is a huge pool of carbon that is naturally there. So it's both breathing a lot and it's storing a lot.
And also you mentioned all of these are extracting CO2 from the ocean. Is it all from the surface level or is it everywhere in the ocean?
That's a good question. I mean, we mostly, when we think about what we want to do, most of these pathways are attempting to do that extraction from the surface. And the reason is because you can't actually have that then transfer of CO2 from the atmosphere unless you keep that depleted CO2 at the surface. So it's really this idealized thing that we want is we want to develop methods which we're going to have that depleted CO2 stay at the surface for as long as possible. So that's one of the important sort of design elements. We've talked about this kind of in the very abstract, but when companies and researchers actually go out and try to test these methods, they're starting to think about some of these practical things like how do we do this depletion as it stays within?
Yeah. Thank you for breaking down for me. The next statement is more challenging.
How would you explain this to an 8-year-old?
Think of the ocean, again, it's just an analogy, as a giant sponge that's holding a lot of carbon and is able to kind of squeeze in and out that carbon in the form of carbon dioxide. And what we're doing in the case of things like ocean alkalinity enhancement, right, is we're just increasing the size of that sponge. We're allowing more carbon to be stored inside of that, right? In the case of things like direct ocean removal, we're taking some out of that sponge, which allows it to absorb a little bit more from the atmosphere. Things like algae, thank you, macroalgae cultivation, and other growing of plants in the ocean. Again, what we're doing is sort of extracting a little bit of that dissolved organic carbon and then allowing it to absorb a little bit more from the.
The first one is making the sponge bigger, and the second and third way is basically make the sponge new, like refreshing it.
Yeah.
How do you make a comparison to the 40,000 gigaton storage capacity?
I think about the sponge analogy as a little bit of a mix of both, right? The sponge is holding carbon, right? You can think of like saturated sponge, right? And then at the same time, it's sort of squeezing in and out carbon. And that carbon that it's squeezing in and out is in the form of carbon dioxide. And the form it's holding inside of it is in the form of these more stable forms of carbon, like bicarbonate. So you can think of it as like storage capacity is like the size of that sponge, right? And then its ability to kind of move in and out is that natural process that the ocean has. The sponge, I think, has been used before, and it breaks down a little bit. It would be interesting to actually ask an 8-year-old, did they understand?
I think 8-year-old would understand. In the past, I have guessed 20-year-old analysts in a direct air capture company. So we come up with this metaphor that she's going to work with the SpongeBob. She have this kind of material. So what she does is she tickles the SpongeBob, so then the SpongeBob have more capacity to absorb the CO2. So it's kind of similar.
So also using the kind of the sponge concept.
Yeah. Next is that you have a question from our previous guest.
What policy changes they would like to see to support the growth of their product in particular?
How I answer that is when I think about the policy changes that I am interested in terms of helping support our ability to sort of understand and potentially adopt ocean-based carbon dioxide. Probably the most important from a policy, move forward into this regime where we can, from a policy perspective, where we're putting more research dollars that's actually supporting the primary research into ocean-based carbon dioxide removal through our federal science agencies into understanding the implementation of marine carbon dioxide removal. It actually is a policy question because, as you know, at least in the U.S., most of the money that goes into science comes through NOAA, Department of Energy, NIST, so a lot of these government agencies. And so what we want to see is actually more federal dollars moving through these agencies that's actually supporting the primary research into ocean-based carbon dioxide removal.
More dollar to push this incentive. Do you have a question for the next guest?
And the question has to do with this person's opinion, who they believe ultimately is going to be the market buyer of climate tech information or climate tech. And I'll just put a little nuance on there, which is that there are some folks who believe that ultimately the buyer of these technologies is going to be government, even if we use private sector to enable those technologies to grow and to create sort of a marketplace around those. And then some people believe it's actually going to be things like corporate actors who are the adoption of either climate technologies or climate risk mitigation. I'm curious whether or not your next person, what their viewpoint on, again, who's actually going to be driving that, the public or the private?
So whether it's the public sector or the private sector to drive the climate tech
adoption and implementation.
What brought you to work in climate?
So back to my introduction, I've been in climate since I was in my 20s. I started in graduate school in climate long before it was an area which received a lot of attention. So it's been my entire career working in the climate side. What brought me there at the time, and this was back in the 90s, right, actually just had to do with my general interest in fluid dynamics. So I'm an engineer by training, and I was very, very interested in what's called computational fluid dynamics. So that's actual modeling of fluid dynamical processes. And I became intrigued by the idea of doing that on a very large scale. So when we think about climate science, at the core of that is actually fluid dynamics, because it's the fluids of the atmosphere. The ocean is a fluid as well. And so at the core of those modeling processes is fluid dynamics. And so it actually was just an interest in that core discipline which brought me to climate.
The natural curiosity about how the climate really works. Thank you so much, Alicia. Let's
make climate
cool again.
I thought that was my 8-year-old. Okay.
That's
wow. We can go back to the sponge. Let's go back to the sponge.